Hey everybody, I think we're going to begin. So welcome to the Roundtable section of Changing Our Ways, a panel of planners and developers. And I recognize some of the names from questions that people were trying to ask questions earlier. So we're few enough people that I would like you to just put your video on, raise your hand, speak out if you have a question. And this is where we can go a bit deeper into some topics of discussion. Does anybody want to start with a topic that is particularly important to them? No?
Come on, Rory, speak up.
I knew you were going to point me out.
Rory, you must.
Well, I've got many issues. It's hard to know where to start.
Well, why don't you just, let's just start the discussion and we'll just have a conversation. Nobody's on the spot. It's just,
Okay.
Let's just
Yeah, I think one of the things that, we've been approached and we've been looking at over the last many years is really around the efficiencies of permitting. And certainly Luke, as a developer, can attest to the amount of time it takes, and it was alluded to in the conversation prior. The amount of time it takes to move a project through its various machinations is really an encumbrance to progress. It's and whether it's capacity, whether it's process, whether it's, I'm going to call it political, I'm going to say interference. We're starting to see some stresses in the industry where we're relying on inertia. We're relying on buildings to be built in a process and in a congruent way that allows developers and builders to go from one to the other to the other. It's particularly relevant when we were looking back a year ago and we were at record high building levels on the island. And we found that if you got out of that queue, you could be out of the queue for a long time with your builder. So, some of the ideas that we like to approach is to try and find try to have discussions with municipalities and cities to try and have a conversation about how can you make it better. The challenge we have is they don't really seem to want to have those conversations at the bureaucrat, within the management, within the process end of it. And it's whether they don't want to or they don't have the ability to make adjustments in a reasonable manner. Now, COVID has gone off and said, we're doing things by Zoom, they're automating processes, but that's still, to take 2 years to do a building, a development permit is far too long, particularly if it goes from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Every year it erodes the pro forma for the developer, and it gets to a point where they're saying it's not worth it anymore. So the ideas that that I'm looking to explore is, and it's good to see, Mayor Orr on the call and, understanding what's happening within those organizations that's precluding a very explicit discussion about development and process. I know Nanaimo's doing it, or they're about to get into it right now, and it's great. The question I have for them is, are you going to listen to the development community and the building community, or are you going to take it and stand and say, well, we know what you want, but this is for us because it makes our job easier.
Okay. Does anybody want to take that, Miko or Mayor Orr? Does anybody want to provide some perspective on that?
Can I speak to that?
Yeah. Hi, Vicky. Yeah, please.
Hi. Yeah, we actually just, we've been having conversations at the village about our planning services and how we might make them more efficient. And what we hear from staff, and I don't want to throw any of my staff under the bus, but that developers come and then they're putting in incomplete applications. And so there's all this back and forth that I think is a lot of the time extensions. And then also trying to build in our public consultation and our communications also takes time, because we're referring applications to different committees, and the committees only meet every, once a month or every 2 weeks or whatever that is. So those, just coordinating the timelines, I think, is a challenge. But maybe if you could tell us a bit more about what the actual holdups are, like, is it the application process? Is it the demands? Is it?
Well, it could be a number of things. We could look at, I'll go to a building permit process where, the city of Victoria, you're looking at, what they're saying is a more complex building, you could have a building permit, what they'll say is 3 to 4 months. Well, it's more like 12 months. And I grant you that there is a complicated, there's the going back before, but what you're saying is it's very complicated. There's so many moving parts that sometimes it's best for a developer to walk in and have that preliminary discussion. More Langford does it. They'll say, bring us your idea, we'll fill it out together. And that allows the checks and balances to be done early. And, I think there's not enough of that collaboration at the very, having a consult within a development authority within a municipality to actually go through it and understand that if something is not, if you can't make a submission in whole, sometimes there might be a good reason and you might be able to rationalize it. And then the staff recommendations, yeah, we get that, but we can't literally meet the letter of every bylaw. No, that's not correct. You can do it, but sometimes there's some interpretation, right? And the interpretation is, there's very narrow view of interpretation of who gets to make the decision. Well, you as an authority gets to make that decision, and often it's to the detriment of the developer. But the element that I think is important is the time. And I think we can all agree that, and I'm going to use Langford as an example, they're turning around development permits and building permits very quickly, right? It goes through a machination. They have a much more collaborative approach with the developer, where they, I think they do that consult. So they kind of get the package together versus don't make it a tennis match. I had to build a ramp I just volunteered to do a ramp for a church with the district of Saanich, and it came back 5 times. And each time I was like, what do you guys, and it was just, it didn't pass. And each time I asked the question, it says, well, you have to review the code. So really it was the amount of 200 millimeter difference in one part of the ramp. It got a little narrow. And I was like, why didn't you just tell me that? And it was like, well, that's for you to figure out, not for me. And I was like, that's what I'm talking about.
But sorry, what you're highlighting, Rory, though, there's 2 parts. There's the there's the rezoning and development permits, and then once you're through, what you think is the hardest part is actually just the beginning of your nightmare when you get into building permits. But the building permit aspect, I think what's important is the weighing down and the time of these components actually works against their own self-interest. If the municipality operates like a business, the faster that capital assets gets built, the faster that property taxes are now charged against that asset. So if processing times are slow, then you need to hire more staff to expedite them. And then they would say, oh, we don't want to resource that additional payroll. But one development project's property taxes could fund, like 5 or 6 staff members per year. So if we start thinking about things on how they hit our budget, and then how do we encourage these cycles to move forward, then that's where kind of that change management starts occurring. But as long as that we're kind of beholden to, time is irrelevant, that's where the problems come from. And as a very brief example, we filed a building permit for 9 months ago in a municipality, and we heard nothing for essentially 9 months. And so we just started excavating without a permit. And then we got a stop work order, and it was costing us $5,000 a day because of demobilization. And so we want affordable housing, but then we're willing to encumber development projects with $5,000 a day of costs because of processing inefficiency.
And what you're talking about, Luke, is not specific just to Victoria. It's up and down the island in some of its capacity. I get that.
I never said Victoria. I don't want to put that on them. I never said Victoria.
No, I meant, sorry, the South, the CRD. Let me put it that way. The CRD. It's up and down the island. Certainly, there's been an issue with capacity, but I also the commentary about how do you, if you have an OCP and you're prescribed and you put a submission in that's completely aligned with zoning, OCP, you know what, that should almost go right to the top of the pile. It should be a very rudimentary evaluation. If it checks all the boxes, get it out the door. And I
That's
think
almost every
that would
application.
be-
Miko
that,
can
you
comment
know, we
that
have-
like
sorry,
OCP amendments are
sorry.
rare,
Pardon me?
Miko, do
but
you
that would
want
be
to
that would
comment
be
on
every application.
Yeah, there OCP amendments are very rare, and there's everything right now, everything's at the top of the pile. So if it's affordable housing, it's at the top of the pile. If it's rental housing, it's at the top of the pile. If it's consistent with your OCP and all the design guidelines, it's at the top of the pile. When you put everything at the top of the pile, there is no top. And so it is a bit difficult in that respect. But in terms of the timing of applications, I think it's a very difficult one because the city of Victoria has implemented a process where we actually we've invented some processes to address the concerns that I think Rory's raising, and the efficiency of those or not is difficult to say. I mean, I'm also doing a building project myself at the moment, and I get frustrated at the process, but it's there are things that municipalities can do. One of the things I think the city of Victoria does well is at the inception of an application, when it first comes in, if it's a rezoning or a development permit, there's a representative from every team, and we sit around in a meeting and we go over the application. Often we try to sit around with that team prior to the application coming in a pre-app meeting. We encourage applicants to always go through the pre-app meeting. We'll have every member of our team and we'll put the time in there. What sometimes doesn't happen is that's usually at the insistence of the applicant. And so if the applicant just submits, I mean, we have no control of what actually happens outside. And so we don't know if something's coming in or not. And sometimes things can just come in. But there is that process where we try to have that collaborative upfront meeting beforehand. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Well, and to any builder, and Lucas on the call, he's kind of told you his stories. Really, there's a time value of money that both applies to the developer and applies to the municipality, particularly when we have a desperate need for housing. I think we should be looking at strategies that look to set a target. If we're doing it in 9 months, let's find a way to do it in 5 and start chipping away and finding processes. Let's not get stuck in paralysis by analysis on this, but putting in some type of strategies that start to demonstrate that the effectiveness is taking hold. Miko, what you're talking about with the city, I've heard about doing that. I talked to Mayor Helps about it. I commend them for that. COVID hit, capacity hit, and now we're strung back out. So obviously there's a lot of things that can impact the process to allow an efficient process to be more accommodating of something like a COVID. So I don't really have a big, I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I know that each community has a different challenge that is delaying projects coming to dirt. And when that happens, again, I appreciate that I represent the ICI sector, not the residential home builders, but they have a similar concern. I'm going to say on a smaller scale, but when it comes to big developments, if you're sitting idle, if you've got money that the bankers have banked on and they're charging you interest, and you've got payroll, and every time you kick it back to the architect because you didn't like the color of the block wall and they've got a redesign, that adds to the cost of that housing. It's not going to be eaten by the developer.
Okay,
you won't have that housing.
Can I respond?
Vicky? Yeah.
I appreciate your explaining further. I really like the suggestion of the pre-app meeting with all the departments. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I just want to speak to the property tax comment that Luke made. Property taxes don't go to pay staff. That's not the intention. The property tax could never cover the cost of staff and the cost of maintaining the neighborhood and the housing or whatever project has been built. That's the problem. That's the innate kind of problem with development, is it doesn't pay for itself over the long run because we have to maintain it a lot longer than we get funds from it. The property taxes just you can't charge people enough property tax. And if you do, you're changing the dynamic and the culture of your community. So from a community perspective, sometimes it's not the best idea for the community for a large project to be built very quickly. Sometimes the community needs some time to come to terms with the fact that that project is coming or whatever. And I think there are ways of doing that that doesn't waste the developer's time, like pre-meetings and coming and having a good OCP and all of those things. But there still is some, I think, necessary kind of community communication and just letting people get ready for it. That is important, and that also takes time.
I agree. I'd like to let one other voice in here briefly. Toby, you've been waiting patiently. Do you want to get in here?
Sure. Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a land development consultant in Central Island, Nanaimo. I worked for local government for 30 years in development, so I see both sides. And I just want to emphasize, it's not just a planning issue, it's planning, engineering, subdivision, and building permits. And Luke's talked a lot about building permits, and building permits have two parts: plan checking and inspection. And inspection generally works okay because they're on demand, and but plan checking is really problematic. What Nanaimo's doing is two things, and I think it was referenced that the municipalities hired a consultant to look at the building permit process and determine how they can quicken that up, and that's going to be underway shortly. And secondly, I'm involved in a development group representing 60 to 80 of the local development community from across the board, virtually everybody, consultants, contractors, what have you. So we're trying to find processes that's going to work, and it's not unlike what the discussion's gone on now. But the issue about staffing, I just want to point out a number of things. Is there's a real concern about indecisive decisions, in that there's a concern to make decisions that might be problematic, and the liability concern is a big aspect in building inspection. So the fact comes down to hiring staff. They're very limited, private sector, public sector. There's not a lot of experienced staff out there, and a lot of the gray hairs are retiring, and in some respects that's good, but it's very hard to hire staff, and some municipalities, I think, have somewhat thrown their hands up and said, we can't find anybody, so we're not going to hire. We'll just have to deal with the staff we have. The second thing is you just got to hire green people and train them, and if they're not, don't work out, just like the private sector does, is they don't stay. One other thing staff do a lot is long, detailed responses. The onus has to be put on the consultants to deal with their applications and make sure they're complete and address the issues. One thing that's not happening in local government, and it's an interesting concept, is a development champion, someone who actually drives projects forward from the municipal side. And that has to be more of a senior position, but someone who can make decisions in that respect. Because the process is just goes on and on. And the other last thing I'll mention, and from a municipality point of view, is we've got to encourage municipalities to try different things. Try for a 6-month process or 12-month, work with the development community and try different things out that's going to improve it, because we're not going to speed this process up unless there's some fairly dramatic changes made. So there's my comments.
Okay. Yes, Kathy.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on something that Vicki had mentioned when you were talking about that it's not just the municipality that slows down the process, that often you get applications in that are complete and so on. And I'm just wondering, is there a way to, is this because it's developers that are coming in that are new and green at doing this, or is there a way of educating and maybe making the forms more explicable, or whatever it is? I'm just wondering, you know, I'm just coming from UDI, just thinking, you know, maybe there's an educational piece that needs to go in there.
I can speak a little bit to the sort of the quality of applications that are received often. And there's a, you know, it's interesting. There's an array of different levels of application that's received, and it's not just filling out the form, it's actually, you know, what is on the drawings and what's missing from the drawings. And usually that's the case, and that's usually what also eats up a lot of time. I think I mean, you can sort of look at the market across the board, and there's an obvious capacity issue when we see sort of more out of town architects coming in, or architects from further afield. And this is from the planning side that I'll typically comment on. That's what I'm most experienced with. But what you can see is there's every municipality has a different way that you would calculate the height of a building. Every municipality has a different way where you calculate the floor area. And so when you get some practitioners from out of city, out of town, or out of province even, there's differences there. So that speaks to a capacity issue where applicants are seeking architects from outside of town. There's also, a wide array, and I think in terms of what you can purchase out there as a developer, you can get the cheap architect for whatever it is, and what ends up actually happening is you can add a lot of time to your plans if they're full of errors and there's no capacity to evaluate them because they're missing information. You can add months to your project, and so it really it pays dividends to hire the best architects and engineers that you can afford, because it makes a huge difference for the timing of your applications going through the city. And I mean, those are sort of the aspects that I can speak to in terms of the quality of applications that are received, because it's very evident. We know which applications are going to come in and which ones are going to be, full of errors and omissions that we'll have to send back out and highlight out this long list of things that need to be done before we can even look at it.
Miko, sorry, you make a good point, and one of the elements that I picked up on was the diversity of communities. Victoria CRD is 13 municipalities, and all have a very different approach to, and I can speak for our members that work throughout those municipalities. It's a challenge where you can play in one sandbox, you can go right to the next one. It's different enough that it changes the inertia. And I talk about inertia in a project, right? That is how we get a tempo of build go that allows the industry to keep up with demand. Without it, we're just going to get stymied.
Okay. Would anybody else like to ask a question or comment? Dirk, did you have your hand up earlier? Nope. Okay.
I would like to.
Yes.
Jeff here, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just a couple of sort of thoughts, and it's a big topic. Half hour doesn't really even touch it. So that's the first thing I'll say. I think would be probably a common understanding that time is money from both sides of this equation. I mean, more times it comes back to staff. The more staff time on things, the more time is added on to the financing of projects. So I think everyone would agree on that. The thing that and again, coming from my background on the technical side, we don't seem to have any metrics for this. And so what frustrates me as an elected official is we talk a lot about anecdotal, or we talk a lot about, well, this took this long or that long. And Luke will remember back when he was the staff at North Saanich, I recall as a counselor at the time even asking the question, well, how come this took X number of months? And that was like a taboo question to ask. Well, for heaven's sakes, how can we improve the timeline unless we actually feel that there's value in assessing how long it is taking us for specific types of built, whether they be building permits, development permits, rezoning, etc. Let's have some sort of metric about where we're at, what's the high and the low, and be able to explain that, because otherwise I don't know how we'll ever solve this thing or move this thing in any direction. So I certainly know I would be committed to that. And if we can get the momentum behind that and find a way to get the development community, and you mentioned Up Island and Nanaimo, and we have a similar thing here, get with the senior planners and let's agree we want to put some effort on this and work through some of those things so that we can agree on maybe there's one or two things we can do to really take a crack at this thing and make some improvements. So just a couple of thoughts. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Just comment on that. I know at the City of Victoria, we have everything kind of under the development tracker. And so one of our jobs is when things are done, you check off your task and it says that was done. And so when, the initial review comes in, we sort of have a time frame of whatever it is, 20 days or 25 days, and that task needs to be done. So you check it off. And then it's a little bit of a tennis game because you say the task internal was completed, and then it says with applicant. And so what we'll often get is an applicant will say, oh, this thing has taken 10 months. You told me it would take 4 months. And we can go and look back at all of the tasks and we can say, well, it was with the applicant for 4, but it was with staff for, or it was with the applicant for 6 and with staff for 4. So we've hit our timelines on it. And I don't actually, I'm not the manager of my department. I'm just a poor planner that just tries to plot ahead. But so I don't know the actual figures, but I do think that we largely are sort of hitting our task timelines in terms of, processing these applications for development permits in 6 months, rezonings in 6 to 8 months. And, sometimes that goes over those timelines, but often we can see there's 3-4 months that is with applicant and when something else is happening. And so I know that the City of Victoria keeps record of those sort of things. And so far, nobody has told me that I'm doing a horrible job, although I may be in terms of hitting those timelines. So I know that we do keep track of it, and it's obviously it is something that municipalities are capable of doing, but it's not too onerous on the planner either, just to note where the application is at. Is it with staff or is it with an applicant? And then you can kind of get some metrics behind it and have something to actually talk about.
Okay, so Luke, I believe you have a question or comment.
Well, to Miko's point there, I appreciate that. Victoria has improved leaps and bounds, but a planner at the City of Victoria, though, Miko, might just say, hey, please realign this sidewalk. And that takes him, a 10-minute email. So now the ball's now in my court, but it takes me 3 months of coordination with consultants to get that back in your court. So I don't think that's necessarily the best way to look at things. And Mayor Orr, you'll remember when I was a planner in North Saanich, we developed a full delegation of all development permits to staff. And DPs went from 8 months of processing to 2 weeks. And so there are tools in our toolkit. And that leads me to the final point, which is the province has just done this DAPR review, this development approvals review process. And they worked with some people on this call might have been a part of that process, but they talked to, probably 1,000 professionals, municipal staff across the province on how can we do development better. And one of them was the implementation of mandatory processing timelines. And if you can't meet those timelines as a jurisdiction, then you hire a third-party reviewer. And the applicant has to pay for it. So I think there's a brainstorm that's already occurred on this very topic at the provincial level. Unfortunately, maybe because of the election, we've seen no action from the province.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Kathy, do you have anything to add to that? Are you aware of what's happening at the provincial level and how it's playing out? Is it being heard at the other levels? Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry, is my experience. What I found and what I hear a lot is that it's the different levels of government. It's the federal, the provincial, and the municipal, and they're not talking to each other. So they're bringing in different policies that often fight against each other. So it really does make the process a lot more onerous. So I know I was involved in that process that Luke was just talking about, and that was one of my points, that it would be really, really nice if all the levels of government were able to, I don't know, create a committee or something that where they did talk to each other, so that the process did run smoothly going down from all levels.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We're coming down to, we have 1 minute left. Would anybody like to get a last word in? Yes, Dirk.
Hello, just to that point that Kathy just made, which I think is really valuable, and this question is for Toby, as you have the perspective from both sides as working for a municipality, hi Toby, as well as now a private developer. Have you seen any efforts for city workers and developers to actually come together to build a plan that's more cohesive?
Yeah, in very simple terms, that's what we're doing right now. We just did it with engineering standards at the city of Nanaimo, and we came together as a group and we made some positive steps forward. We're trying to do that again, and I think the South Island has tried to do that again with 13 municipalities. I work in about 8 up in this area. So we've just got to come together and learn from each other and learn from what's even happening internationally. Is just fine. We have to change the system. It's too bogged down right now, in my estimation. And I know staff level, they're tremendously frustrated and burnt out because of the volume of work, and that's not going to change.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
You know, this has been a fabulous discussion. I wish we had more time. I want to thank you all for being here. And again, I'd like to thank Kathy, Luke, and Miko as our panelists. I can tell you, as long as I've been doing business reporting, this has been a topic of discussion. So we've hopefully something will come out of this that will be able to move the conversations that we're having forward. And there have been some very important conversations here today. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Take care now.